different is that it literally started with kind of three, albeit admittedly subjective descriptions of the standards. And so there are a lot of mathematicians, particularly out there in the world, who always tell me I shouldn't describe the standards this way. I think it's helpful. First of all, in order for standards to drive instruction, they had to be fewer in number. So when I worked at the State Department in New Jersey, if I ever had a convening like this, typically about a month and a half before, I'd say, okay, am I going to give people a copy of the standards? Like, do I have enough money in my budget to order that really big paper, figure out which printer in the department is able to handle that really big paper, and just the sheer volume of the document, communicated significantly. And when we were going through the standards, adoption consideration in our state, I remember, going to a meeting with a group of teachers and saying, okay, I'm going to give them a grade level of standards in math. And it literally fit on one piece of paper, 8.5 by 11, not even the big paper, just the regular paper, both sides, no margins and 6-point font, but it did all fit on one piece of paper. And that's significant. I mean, as a teacher, that is significant. When you can say, I can hold and sit down and look at all of the expectations that my kids have for this year, that is significant. And that these standards are so few that they are in fact expected for all students is a significant change from these voluminous documents of standards that preceded them. The second description is that these standards are clear. Again, another subjective term, because Illinois, I'm sure like most other states, had a particular language for how you describe math, how you describe literacy. I know in New Jersey, we right away had to change from calling it language arts literacy, no, English language arts to language arts literacy, and that was the first horror that we had to deal with, a change in language. But when we say these standards are clearer, it doesn't mean they're easy to read. They're certainly pretty detailed and in some cases quite challenging. But when you read them, it right away gives you a sense of what the performance should look like. I promise you won't see a standard that says explore concepts with fractions. Like, what does it look like when a kid's proficient in exploring concepts with fractions? Who knows, right? It's not really that kind of a statement. And so that's what we mean by a set of standards that are clearer. And the third significant thing to know about these standards in description is that they are higher. Notice I didn't say they're harder. I said they're higher. So we're not talking about a set of standards that is requiring our second graders to solve calculus equations and to read War and Peace. That would be harder, stupid, but harder. And these are in fact a set of standards that are higher. So let's all remind ourselves that education didn't invent the concept of having standards. There are many industries out there that have standards. And can you imagine going to Home Depot, whatever, buying an appliance, and it said, meet standards, safety standards. And you think, some of the standards, some of the time, most of the time. What it in fact means to have high standards is when it is expected, when it is declared, it is in fact expected. So in the third grade in math again, we have a standard in the Common Core that says students will be able to fluently multiply within 100. It's in there. It's a high standard because the expectation isn't the top 25% of students will be able to do that. Isn't the students that come from, two-parent homes, college degreed, will do that. It's a high standard because these standards are built on the idea that all kids will get there. In making decisions about at which grade level to put things in, we didn't just decide, let's start everything earlier, let's make our kindergartners do more hard work in kindergarten. That wasn't the idea at all. It was how can we build a staircase of progressive expectations so that by the time kids graduate high school, they will have the knowledge and skills necessary to be successful in whatever they choose to do afterwards. And so the way that we got to fewer, clearer, higher standards is to do something that we all too often don't do in education, which is to start off with the evidence. In order to get to fewer standards, we needed to do more than just have, the typical, I know at least the way we used to develop standards in New Jersey. You bring together stakeholder groups, people who you like and people who speak to the press, And you ask them to kind of have conversations about, so what do you think should be in the standards? And what do you think should be in the standards? You know, what's your experience tell you? What kind of platform lobbying perspective are you going to take? And listen, we only have until 3 o'clock today. So, okay, I'll give you what you want, you get what you want, and we just kind of grew these documents. A colleague of mine used to call this democracy gone amok. Everybody just gets their thing in there, and it was never with the idea of what do kids really need? How do we know they really need that? So these standards started with this idea of taking a look at international standards, taking a look at what's actually being expected in technical programs, trade schools, apprenticeships, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges. And in order to make decisions about what needed to be cut out, we had to look at the evidence. So let me just say that it's not to say that things that are no longer in the standards are evil. It's not to say that those things are going to rot the brains of our students, but it's to say we adopted the Common Core. We typically did not give you all more money or more time. So how can we finally be adult about this and say, yes, there are some things that matter more than others. And those are the things that we need to signal to teachers, to kids, to parents, that we really need to be focusing on and investing in. They shouldn't be seen as a limitation, particularly if you're in a high-performing district, but there should be a signal that these are the things that matter. And if you are a teacher in a classroom where kids are struggling on these things, it means something very different than if kids are struggling on something that you happen to integrate into your program that's not in the standards. These are the things that matter most for kids. And then the third bullet up here, I just want to highlight for all of you, because this is kind of this rare moment in time. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced this. I think this is my first time experiencing this, where we start an initiative in education by saying the first thing to do is decide what you're going to stop doing. Not here's one more thing to do, as if we weren't already maxed out with time and initiatives. But the first step in Common Core implementation is to decide how you are going to make time and space in your work in order to get this to happen. So there were all kinds of ideas that people submitted when we went through all the teacher feedback processes and so on about, well, what about this concept in math and what about this concept in literacy? Isn't that good and important? And every time those comments were considered, the idea was, is it important enough to take time away from the things that were already in the standards? And if it was, then it got included. And if it wasn't, we kept it out. And so these are a set of standards that are probably for the first time in consideration of honesty about time. But I will tell you that with the numerous kind of groups that are doing research on the implementation of these standards, as much as we've been begging for this message, like let's start with the power of the eraser before the power of the pen, teachers and schools are completely resistant to this notion of stopping certain things. And I can guess why. I mean, there are a group of us who think this is going to go away, and if I throw out that project, it'll just come back again. You know, there are people who think, you know, it's on a test somewhere, our kids have to get that. Or probably most relevant, we just don't have enough resources in the things that we're to be focusing on, that we don't know how we're going to fill the time if you're telling me to cut all that other stuff out of my curriculum. So this is a